The words hit me like a slap across the face as I stood in my own kitchen, holding the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir my famous beef stew. "This is gross old people food, Grandma Rosalind," my 12-year-old grandson Marcus declared, pushing his bowl away with theatrical disgust. "Can't we just order pizza like normal families?" His mother, my daughter-in-law Vanessa, didn't even look up from her phone as she sat at my dining table. In fact, I could swear I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward in what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing Marcus's visit, just like I had every Sunday for the past 6 years since my son Oliver had started bringing his family for our weekly dinners. The beef stew was a recipe that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family, a recipe that had comforted my own children through scraped knees and broken hearts, that had been the centerpiece of countless celebrations and gatherings. The same recipe that Marcus had devoured enthusiastically just 2 years ago, always asking for seconds and sometimes even thirds. But standing there in my kitchen, watching my grandson's face contort with exaggerated revulsion, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of our family. This wasn't the first time Marcus had made disparaging comments about my cooking, but it was the most direct, the most hurtful, and the most public. Vanessa's presence at the table, combined with her obvious approval of his behavior, told me everything I needed to know about who was behind this sudden change in attitude. My name is Rosalind Pemberton, and at 73 years old, I've lived through enough family drama to recognize manipulation when I see it. I raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband died in a car accident when Oliver was only 8 years old. I built a successful catering business from nothing, working 16-hour days to keep food on the table and my children in decent schools. I've weathered financial hardships, health scares, and the normal challenges that come with raising a family, but nothing had prepared me for the systematic campaign of disrespect that seemed to be emanating from my own grandson. The kitchen where we stood had been the heart of my home for over 40 years. The walls were painted a warm yellow that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay window, and every surface held memories of meals shared, conversations had, and love expressed through food. The wooden countertops bore the gentle scars of decades of meal preparation, and the vintage copper pots hanging from the rack above the island had been my mother's before they became mine. This wasn't just a kitchen, it was a sanctuary, a place where I had poured my heart into nourishing the people I loved most. Oliver emerged from the living room, where he'd been watching football, his expression immediately shifting from relaxed contentment to uncomfortable awareness as he took in the scene. My son was 35 years old, tall and lean like his father had been, with kind brown eyes that reflected his generally gentle nature. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, a steady job that provided well for his family but didn't exactly make him wealthy. That distinction belonged to me, though it wasn't something I flaunted or even discussed very often. "Marcus," Oliver said carefully, his voice carrying a warning tone that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had conversations about respectful behavior. "That's not how we talk to Grandma Rosalind." Marcus rolled his eyes with the dramatic flair that only a 12-year-old could muster. "But Dad, it really is gross. Why can't she make normal food like McDonald's or something? Why does everything have to be so old-fashioned and weird?" The words stung more than I wanted to admit. This was the same child who had spent countless afternoons in this very kitchen, standing on a step stool beside me as we rolled out pie crust together, his small hands eagerly helping to measure ingredients and stir batters. He had been my eager sous chef, my enthusiastic taste tester, my willing student as I passed down not just recipes but family history through the stories that accompanied each dish. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone, and I caught something in her expression that confirmed my growing suspicions. There was a satisfaction there, a pleased smugness that suggested Marcus's outburst wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared. She was 32 years old, blonde and petite, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of regular salon visits and expensive skincare routines. She'd married Oliver 4 years ago, and from the beginning I'd sensed an underlying tension between us that I'd attributed to the normal adjustment period of blending families. "You know, Rosalind," Vanessa said, her tone carefully modulated to sound reasonable and concerned, "maybe it would be easier if we just ordered takeout for these family dinners. It would save you all the work, and the kids would probably enjoy it more. The suggestion was delivered with a smile, but I heard the subtext clearly. My cooking wasn't good enough. My traditions weren't valuable enough. My role as the family matriarch wasn't important enough to preserve. This wasn't about convenience or saving me work. This was about systematically dismantling the foundation of our family gatherings, and by extension my place within the family structure. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let someone half my age undermine everything I'd built. The beef stew simmering on my stove represented more than just a meal. It represented generations of women who had loved their families through food, who had created connection and comfort through the simple act of sharing a home-cooked meal. But as I looked at Marcus's disgusted expression and Vanessa's satisfied smirk, I realized that they had no understanding or appreciation for what I was trying to preserve. Oliver looked between his wife and his mother, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Marcus, apologize to your grandmother right now," he said firmly. "She spent all afternoon making this dinner for us. Why should I apologize for telling the truth?" Marcus shot back, his voice rising with preteen indignation. "Just because she's old doesn't mean I have to pretend her food is good when it's not." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the kitchen wall, the gentle bubbling of the stew on the stove, and the distant sound of a lawnmower from somewhere in the neighborhood. But mostly I could hear the sound of my own heart breaking, as I realized that the child I had loved unconditionally, the grandson I had spoiled and cherished and doted upon, had been taught to view me as nothing more than an inconvenient old woman, whose contributions to the family were no longer valued or wanted. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew except for my lawyer and my financial advisor, was that his future was intricately tied to my good graces, in ways that went far beyond weekly family dinners. When my husband died, the insurance settlement combined with my successful catering business had allowed me to build a substantial investment portfolio. Over the years, I had been quietly and systematically building trust funds for each of my grandchildren, planning to surprise them with the news when they turned 18. Marcus's trust fund currently held over $200,000, money that had been earmarked for his college education, his first car, perhaps even a down payment on his first home. It was money that I had worked hard to accumulate, sacrificing luxuries for myself so that I could provide opportunities for the next generation. But standing in my kitchen, listening to my grandson dismiss not just my cooking but everything I represented, I began to question whether someone who held such contempt for me and my contributions deserved to benefit from my generosity. The idea that began forming in my mind wasn't born out of spite or revenge, though I won't pretend those emotions weren't part of the equation. It was born out of a recognition that respect isn't something that should be taken for granted, that appreciation isn't something that can be demanded, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to allow them to experience the consequences of their choices. Vanessa's influence over Marcus had been subtle but persistent over the past 2 years. I had watched as she gradually introduced ideas about modern versus old-fashioned, convenient versus traditional, practical versus sentimental. She had a way of making her preferences seem obviously superior, while making mine seem quaint at best and burdensome at worst. It wasn't that she was overtly disrespectful, she was far too clever for that. Instead, she employed a death-by-a-thousand-cuts approach, slowly undermining my authority and my relevance through a series of small comments and subtle redirections. The campaign had been so gradual that I hadn't fully recognized it until this moment, standing in my kitchen with my grandson's words echoing in my ears. She had been systematically training him to view me as out of touch, irrelevant, and unnecessary. And she had been remarkably successful. Oliver was still trying to mediate the situation, his discomfort obvious as he attempted to balance his loyalty to his mother with his desire to keep peace in his marriage. "Marcus, regardless of your personal preferences, your grandmother has been nothing but kind and generous to you. The least you can do is show some gratitude and respect. But why do I have to pretend to like something when I don't?" Marcus whined, slouching in his chair with the entitled attitude of a child who had never been required to consider anyone's feelings but his own. "It's not my fault she makes weird food." The casual cruelty of his words, delivered without any apparent awareness of their impact, crystallized something inside me. This wasn't just about disrespecting my cooking, this was about a fundamental lack of empathy and consideration that spoke to deeper character issues. And if Vanessa was cultivating these attitudes in Marcus, what kind of adult was he going to become? I had always believed that children needed to be taught the value of respect, gratitude, and consideration for others. These weren't innate qualities, they were learned behaviors that required consistent modeling and reinforcement. But somewhere along the way, Marcus had learned that his comfort and preferences were more important than other people's feelings, that his opinions carried more weight than other people's efforts, and that he could express his disdain without consequence. The trust fund had been my way of showing love, of providing opportunities and security for my grandchildren. But love without boundaries isn't really love, it's enabling. And providing opportunities to someone who showed no appreciation or respect for the source of those opportunities seemed not just pointless but potentially harmful. As I stood there processing the implications of what had just happened, I began to formulate a plan. It wouldn't be about punishment, exactly, though consequences would certainly be involved. It would be about education, about helping Marcus understand the connection between choices and outcomes, between respect and rewards, between gratitude and generosity. The first step would be simple. I would continue our Sunday dinners exactly as they had always been. I would prepare the same family recipes with the same love and attention to detail. I would set the table with my grandmother's china, and light the candles that had graced our family gatherings for decades. And I would observe carefully to see whether this outburst was an aberration or part of a larger pattern of disrespect. If it was indeed part of a pattern, if Marcus continued to show contempt for me and my efforts, then I would begin the process of redirecting his trust fund to more deserving recipients. I had other grandchildren after all, and I had always supported various charitable organizations that worked with underprivileged children, who would be grateful for educational opportunities. The second step would involve a careful documentation of Marcus's behavior and attitudes over the coming weeks and months. I wasn't going to make any rash decisions based on a single incident, no matter how hurtful it had been. But I was going to pay much closer attention to the dynamics at play in our family interactions, and I was going to start asking myself some difficult questions about whether my generosity was being taken for granted. The third step would be the most challenging. I would need to have some honest conversations with Oliver about what I was observing and what my concerns were for Marcus's character development. My son was a good man, but he was also caught between competing loyalties, and it was possible that he hadn't fully recognized the extent to which his wife was influencing his son's attitudes toward me. None of this would happen overnight, and none of it would be easy. But as I looked around my kitchen, at the evidence of all the love and care I had poured into this family over the years, I knew that I couldn't simply accept disrespect as the new normal. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to allow someone who saw no value in what I offered to benefit from my generosity without question. The afternoon sunlight was beginning to fade as Oliver finally managed to extract a grudging apology from Marcus, though it was clear that the words were empty and coerced rather than genuine. Vanessa gathered her purse and began making noises about needing to get home, her satisfaction with the day's events barely concealed beneath a veneer of polite concern for my feelings. As they prepared to leave, I hugged Marcus goodbye, as I always did, though his response was perfunctory and distant. "Thank you for dinner, Grandma Rosalind," he mumbled, the words clearly prompted by his father's stern look. "You're welcome, sweetheart," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my heart. "I'll see you next Sunday." But as I watched their car pull out of my driveway, I knew that next Sunday would be different. I would be watching and listening and evaluating in ways that I hadn't before. And depending on what I observed, Marcus might discover that his trust fund, like respect, was something that could disappear more quickly than it had been built. The kitchen felt unnaturally quiet after they left, the only sounds the gentle ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I began clearing the table mechanically, scraping Marcus's barely touched bowl of stew into the garbage disposal, the waste of good food adding insult to injury. As I loaded the dishwasher, I found myself thinking about my own childhood, about the lessons my mother had taught me about respect and gratitude, about the way she had modeled grace and dignity even in difficult circumstances. My mother had raised me to believe that how you treated people, especially those who were older or who had done things for you, was a reflection of your character. She had taught me that saying please and thank you wasn't just good manners, it was an acknowledgement of other people's humanity and worth. And she had shown me through her own example that generosity should be met with appreciation, not entitlement. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been lost on Marcus. Whether through Vanessa's influence or simple neglect, he had learned that his comfort was paramount, that his preferences were the only ones that mattered, and that the people who loved him would continue to provide for him regardless of how he treated them. It was a painful realization, but it was also a clarifying one. The trust fund I had been building for Marcus was substantial enough to change the trajectory of his life, but it was also substantial enough to change someone else's life, if redirected to a more deserving recipient. The question was whether Marcus would demonstrate, over the coming weeks and months, that he was worthy of such a gift. As I finished cleaning the kitchen, I made a mental note to call my lawyer first thing Monday morning. Not to make any immediate changes, but to understand exactly what my options were regarding the trust funds I had established. I wanted to know whether I could modify the terms, whether I could redirect the funds to other beneficiaries, and whether I could establish performance criteria that would need to be met before the funds could be accessed. The evening stretched ahead of me, quiet and contemplative. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair with a book, but my mind kept wandering back to the expression on Marcus's face as he pushed away my stew, the casual cruelty in his voice as he dismissed something I had put my heart into creating. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new opportunities to observe and evaluate and plan. But tonight I would grieve for the relationship I thought I had with my grandson, and I would begin preparing for the difficult decisions that lay ahead. The trust fund that had been growing quietly in Marcus's name for the past 6 years represented more than just money. It represented my hopes and dreams for his future, my desire to give him opportunities I had never had, my love expressed through financial planning and careful investment. But love, I was beginning to understand, wasn't just about giving, it was also about expecting and requiring certain standards of behavior in return. And if Marcus couldn't meet those standards, if he couldn't learn to show basic respect and appreciation for the people who loved him, then perhaps he wasn't ready for the responsibility that would come with a substantial inheritance. Perhaps he needed to learn some harder lessons about consequences and accountability before he could be trusted with the kind of generosity I had been planning to bestow upon him. The clock on the mantel chimed 9 times, marking the end of what had been one of the most difficult and eye-opening days I had experienced in years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the week ahead, about the conversations I would need to have, and the decisions I would need to make. Marcus had called my cooking gross old people food, dismissing not just my efforts but my very identity as someone whose contributions mattered. What he didn't know was that this gross old person had been quietly and systematically building him a future that most kids his age could only dream of. And what he was about to learn was that trust funds, like respect, were privileges that could be revoked when taken for granted. The irony wasn't lost on me, that a child who found my traditional cooking so offensive might soon discover just how much he had depended on the traditional values of hard work, sacrifice, and generosity that he seemed so eager to dismiss. But that was a lesson for another day, and a story that was just beginning to unfold. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp October air that usually filled me with energy and purpose, but as I sat in my home office with my second cup of coffee, I felt the weight of yesterday's events settling heavily on my shoulders. The mahogany desk that had belonged to my late husband seemed like the appropriate place to begin what I was already thinking of as my investigation into the true state of my family relationships. My first call was to Gerald Hutchinson, the attorney who had been handling my legal affairs for the past 15 years. Gerald was a meticulous man in his early 60s, someone who understood the complexities of estate planning, and had helped me structure the trust funds in ways that would provide maximum benefit to my grandchildren, while also protecting the assets from potential mismanagement or external manipulation. Rosalind, Gerald's warm voice came through the phone, carrying the slight formality that characterized all of our professional interactions. "How can I help you today?" I explained the situation as objectively as I could, describing Marcus's behavior and my growing concerns about whether he was developing the kind of character that would make him a responsible steward of a substantial inheritance. Gerald listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding that told me he was taking notes. "I see," he said when I finished, And you're wondering about your options regarding the trust fund modifications. Exactly, I want to understand what's possible before I make any decisions. This isn't about punishment, Gerald, it's about responsibility and accountability. There was a pause while Gerald reviewed what I assumed were the original trust documents. The way we structured Marcus's trust gives you considerable discretionary authority until he reaches the age of 25. You can modify the terms, change the beneficiaries, or even dissolve the trust entirely if you determine that doing so would be in his best interests or if he fails to meet certain behavioral or academic standards. The relief I felt was immediate and profound. I had been worried that the trust was irrevocable, that my hands would be tied regardless of how Marcus's character developed. What kind of standards could I implement? Academic performance, community service requirements, demonstrated financial responsibility, character references from teachers or mentors. The key is that any standards you implement need to be clearly defined and objectively measurable. You can't make the trust contingent on something as subjective as being nice to grandma, but you could require him to maintain a certain grade point average, complete a specified number of volunteer hours, or demonstrate financial literacy through coursework or practical experience. As Gerald explained the legal framework, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what I was considering. This wasn't just about Marcus's trust fund, it was about the kind of adults I wanted my grandchildren to become, and the role that financial incentives could play in encouraging positive character development. There's something else, Gerald continued. If you decide to modify Marcus's trust, you'll want to consider how that decision might affect your relationships with Oliver and Vanessa. Family money has a way of complicating family dynamics, especially when there are perceived inequities in how different family members are treated. This was the aspect of the situation that worried me most. Oliver was a good man who found himself caught between his loyalty to his mother and his obligations to his wife. He didn't deserve to be put in an impossible position because of decisions I made regarding Marcus's inheritance. But at the same time, I couldn't allow my concern for Oliver's comfort to prevent me from making decisions that I believed were in Marcus's best long-term interests. After ending the call with Gerald, I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the financial documents related to all of my grandchildren's trust funds. Marcus wasn't my only grandchild, though he was the one I saw most frequently due to our weekly Sunday dinners. My daughter Catherine had 2 children, Emma and James, who lived across the country with their father after Catherine's divorce 3 years ago. My youngest son Michael had a daughter named Sophie who was only 4 years old. Each of these children had trust funds that I had been building systematically over the years, though none of them were as substantial as Marcus's simply because I had been contributing to his for the longest period of time. Emma was 15 and had always been a respectful, academically motivated child, who wrote me thoughtful letters and called me on holidays. James was 13 and showed genuine interest in learning about our family history and traditions. Sophie was too young to evaluate, but Michael had always emphasized the importance of gratitude and respect in her upbringing. The contrast between Marcus's entitled attitude and his cousin's consistent appreciation for my role in their lives was stark and troubling. It suggested that the problem wasn't generational or cultural, but specific to the environment that Oliver and Vanessa had created in their home. My second call of the day was to Margaret Santos, my financial advisor who had been helping me manage the investment portfolios that funded the trust accounts. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 40s, who had started her own firm after working for one of the major investment houses for over a decade. She understood both the technical aspects of wealth management and the emotional complexities that often accompanied family financial planning. "I've been thinking about restructuring some of the trust allocations," I told Margaret after we had exchanged pleasantries. "I want to understand what the implications would be if I decided to redirect funds from one beneficiary to others." Margaret was familiar with the details of my estate planning, so she didn't need extensive background information to understand what I was considering. "Are we talking about a temporary reallocation or a permanent change in beneficiaries?" "Potentially permanent, depending on how certain behavioral patterns develop over the next few months. In that case, you'll want to be very careful about documentation and timing. If you're going to make changes based on behavioral criteria, you'll want to establish clear benchmarks and give the affected party reasonable opportunity to meet those benchmarks. Otherwise, you could face legal challenges down the road. This was something I hadn't fully considered. While Gerald had assured me that I had the legal authority to modify the trusts, Margaret was raising the possibility that my decisions could be contested if they appeared arbitrary or vindictive. The last thing I wanted was to create a situation where family legal battles would consume the very resources I had worked so hard to accumulate for my grandchildren's benefit. What would you recommend in terms of creating a paper trail that would document the reasoning behind any changes I might make? Start keeping detailed records of interactions and behaviors that concern you. Date everything, be specific about what was said and done, and try to focus on objective observations rather than subjective interpretations. If you decide to implement performance standards, communicate those standards clearly and in writing, with specific timelines and measurable criteria. The conversation with Margaret crystallized something important for me. This process couldn't be about emotional reactions or hurt feelings, no matter how justified those feelings might be. It had to be about establishing clear expectations and consistent consequences, the same principles that had guided me in raising my own children. That afternoon, I drove to the local office supply store and purchased a dedicated notebook that would serve as my record-keeping system. I labeled it Family Dynamics Documentation and began by writing a detailed account of Sunday's dinner, including direct quotes from Marcus and descriptions of Vanessa's behavior. I noted the date, the time, the specific context of the conversation, and my observations about the reactions of everyone present. The act of writing everything down in clear factual language helped me process what had happened with less emotional intensity. Reading my own words, I could see that Marcus's outburst wasn't just a moment of childish rudeness, it was part of a pattern of disrespectful behavior that had been escalating over time. I could also see that Vanessa's response to his rudeness suggested that she was not only tolerating his disrespect but possibly encouraging it. The next step in my investigation involved reaching out to people who interacted with Marcus in different contexts, to see whether his disrespectful attitude was limited to his interactions with me, or whether it represented a broader character issue. I started with his teachers, using the pretext of being a concerned grandmother who wanted to support his academic success. Marcus attended Riverside Middle School, a well-regarded public school in a suburban district that served families from a range of economic backgrounds. His sixth-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Williamson, was a woman in her late 30s who had been teaching for over 15 years and had a reputation for being both demanding and fair with her students. "I'm calling to check on how Marcus is adjusting to middle school," I told Mrs. Williamson when I reached her during her planning period. "His parents mentioned that he's been having some behavioral challenges at home, and I wondered if you were seeing similar issues in the classroom." Mrs. Williamson's response was diplomatically worded but revealing. "Marcus is certainly capable of doing the work, but he does seem to struggle with authority figures, particularly when he's asked to do something he doesn't want to do. He can be argumentative when he receives feedback, and he doesn't always treat substitute teachers or support staff with the same respect he shows to me." This was exactly the kind of information I had been hoping to gather. Marcus's disrespectful attitude wasn't limited to our family dinners, it was a broader pattern that extended to his interactions with other adults in positions of authority. Has he shown improvement over the course of the semester, or do these issues seem to be getting worse? I'd say they've remained fairly consistent. He's not a bad kid, Mrs. Pemberton, but he does seem to have an inflated sense of his own importance sometimes. He acts like the rules that apply to other students shouldn't necessarily apply to him. After ending the call with Mrs. Williamson, I spoke with Marcus's soccer coach, his piano teacher, and the director of the after-school program he attended twice a week. The pattern that emerged from these conversations was consistent and troubling. Marcus showed respect and compliance when he was dealing with people he perceived as important or authoritative, but he was dismissive and sometimes openly rude to people he viewed as beneath his notice. The soccer coach described incidents where Marcus had argued with referees and made disparaging comments about opponents from less affluent schools. The piano teacher mentioned that Marcus frequently complained about having to practice pieces he considered boring and had made rude comments about other students who weren't as naturally talented as he was. The after-school program director said that Marcus often tried to get out of cleanup duties and had been heard making comments about how certain activities were beneath him. Each of these conversations painted a picture of a child who was developing some very concerning attitudes about his place in the world and his obligations to others. This wasn't just about disrespecting his grandmother, this was about a fundamental lack of empathy and consideration that could have serious implications for his development into a responsible, caring adult. That evening, I called Catherine in Denver to get her perspective on the family dynamics she had observed during her visits home. Catherine was my middle child, a successful marketing executive who had always been perceptive about interpersonal relationships and family patterns. "Mom, I've been worried about Marcus for a while," Catherine said when I explained why I was calling. "The last time I visited, I was really surprised by how he talked to you. It wasn't just disrespectful, it was almost contemptuous, and Vanessa just sat there like it was perfectly normal. Have you noticed any changes in Oliver's behavior as well? He seems caught in the middle, which I can understand to some extent. But I think he's so focused on keeping peace in his marriage that he's not really addressing the bigger picture of what's happening with Marcus's character development." Catherine's observations confirmed what I had been seeing, but had been hesitant to fully acknowledge. This wasn't a phase that Marcus would outgrow naturally, it was a pattern that was being reinforced by the family environment Oliver and Vanessa had created. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "Emma mentioned that during their last video call, Marcus made some pretty awful comments about you and about our family traditions. He said that our Sunday dinners were old people stuff, and that he didn't understand why they had to keep pretending to care about things that didn't matter anymore." The fact that Marcus was expressing these attitudes to his cousins was particularly concerning. It suggested that his disrespect for me and for our family traditions wasn't just something he was keeping within his immediate household, he was actively trying to influence other family members to adopt similar attitudes. The following Sunday, I implemented the first phase of my plan. I prepared our traditional family dinner exactly as I always did, but I also prepared a detailed observation strategy that would allow me to document Marcus's behavior throughout the visit. I set up a small digital recorder in the kitchen, positioned so that it would capture conversations during meal preparation and cleanup. I also prepared a list of specific questions and topics that would give Marcus opportunities to demonstrate respect and gratitude. Oliver, Vanessa, and Marcus arrived at their usual time, and the initial interactions followed familiar patterns. Marcus greeted me with a perfunctory hug, and immediately began asking about what we were having for dinner, his tone suggesting that he expected to be disappointed. "I made your favorite pot roast," I told him, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "Pot roast isn't my favorite anymore," he replied dismissively. "That's kid food, I like more sophisticated things now." I made a mental note of his exact words and continued with my normal dinner preparations, inviting Marcus to help me set the table as I had done countless times before. In the past, he had always been eager to help, taking pride in arranging the silverware correctly and folding the napkins the way I had taught him. "Do I have to?" he asked when I suggested he help with the table setting. "Can't Vanessa do it? She's better at that kind of stuff." Vanessa, who had been scrolling through her phone in the living room, looked up with what appeared to be genuine surprise.
"Marcus, your grandmother asked you to help. It's not going to kill you to set a table," but even as she said the words, her tone lacked conviction, and I could see that this was more about maintaining appearances than about actually expecting Marcus to show respect and helpfulness. Marcus grudgingly began placing plates around the table, but he did so with obvious reluctance and frequent complaints about how long it was taking and how much he would rather be doing other things. When I asked him to be careful with the china plates that had belonged to my grandmother, he rolled his eyes and muttered something about how ridiculous it was to use fancy dishes for a regular dinner. During the meal itself, Marcus's behavior was consistently problematic. He complained about the texture of the vegetables, asked why we couldn't just have salad from a bag instead of the fresh green salad I had prepared, and made several comments about how restaurants could make the same food faster and probably better. He also spent much of the dinner playing with his phone despite repeated requests from his father to put it away. But the most telling moment came when Oliver asked Marcus to tell me about a recent school project he had completed. Marcus had been assigned to interview an older family member about their life experiences and create a presentation about how things had changed over the generations. "Who did you interview for your project?" I asked, genuinely interested and hoping that perhaps he had gained some appreciation for family history through the assignment. "I interviewed Vanessa's grandmother," Marcus replied without looking up from his phone. "She's more interesting than our family. She used to live in New York and worked in fashion. She has better stories." The casual dismissal of our entire family history in favor of someone he perceived as more glamorous was painful, but it was also illuminating. Marcus had been given an opportunity to connect with his heritage, to learn about the struggles and sacrifices that had made his comfortable life possible, and he had chosen instead to focus on someone whose experiences seemed more exciting to him. "What kinds of stories did she tell you?" I asked, genuinely curious about what Marcus found so compelling about Vanessa's grandmother. "Stories about famous people she met, and fancy parties and traveling to Europe for work. Real stuff, not just cooking and taking care of kids." The implication that my life experiences were somehow less real than those of someone who had worked in a glamorous industry cut deeply. I had raised 3 children as a single mother, built a successful business from nothing, and created financial security for my family through decades of hard work and careful planning. But in Marcus's worldview, none of that mattered because it wasn't exciting or glamorous enough to capture his interest. Oliver's discomfort with his son's dismissive attitude was obvious, but his attempts to redirect the conversation were half-hearted and ineffective. Vanessa, meanwhile, seemed pleased that her grandmother had been chosen over me for the school project, though she tried to hide her satisfaction behind expressions of sympathy for my feelings. After dinner, I asked Marcus if he would like to help me with the dishes, a tradition that had been one of our special bonding times when he was younger. He would stand on a step stool beside me at the sink, carefully drying each plate and telling me about his week while I washed. "Can't you just put them in the dishwasher?" he asked with obvious exasperation. "Why do you always have to make everything so complicated? Some of these dishes are too delicate for the dishwasher," I explained. "And besides, I enjoy having the time to talk while we clean up together." "Well, I don't enjoy it," Marcus replied bluntly. "It's boring and it takes forever. Can I just go watch TV instead?" This was the moment when I realized that my investigation had yielded all the information I needed. Marcus's disrespect wasn't limited to his comments about my cooking. It extended to every aspect of our relationship and every tradition we had shared. He saw no value in spending time with me, no appreciation for the effort I put into our family gatherings, and no interest in maintaining the connections that had once meant so much to both of us. As I watched him slouch off to the living room to stare at his phone while the adults cleaned up the kitchen, I made my decision. Marcus would have opportunities over the coming months to demonstrate that he could change his attitude and behavior, but those opportunities would come with clearly defined expectations and consequences. The trust fund that I had been building for his future would remain in place for now, but it would no longer be a guaranteed inheritance. It would become contingent on his ability to demonstrate the kinds of character traits that I believed were essential for responsible adulthood: respect for others, gratitude for opportunities, empathy for people in different circumstances, and a willingness to contribute to family and community rather than simply taking what was offered to him. That evening, after Oliver's family had gone home, I called Gerald to schedule a meeting for the following week. It was time to formalize the changes I wanted to make to Marcus's trust fund, to establish clear criteria that would govern his access to those funds, and to begin the process of redirecting some of those resources to beneficiaries who had demonstrated the kind of character that I wanted to reward and encourage. The investigation phase of my plan was complete. Now it was time to move forward with the consequences that Marcus's behavior had earned, and the lessons that I hoped would ultimately benefit not just him, but every member of our family who was paying attention to how choices and character intersected with opportunity and reward. Over the following week, I documented 3 more incidents that reinforced my concerns about Marcus's developing character. On Tuesday, Oliver called to tell me that Marcus had been suspended from his after-school program for making fun of a younger child whose family couldn't afford the latest gaming system.
On Thursday, Vanessa posted on social media about how proud she was that Marcus had stood up to a difficult teacher who had given him a poor grade on an assignment. Though when I spoke with Oliver privately, it became clear that the teacher's feedback had been both fair and constructive. On Saturday, I witnessed firsthand how Marcus treated service workers when we encountered him and Vanessa at the grocery store. Marcus was rude to the teenager bagging their groceries, complained loudly about having to wait in line behind an elderly woman who was moving slowly, and made disparaging comments about the store's selection compared to the upscale market where Vanessa usually shopped. Each of these incidents added to the growing file of documentation that would support the changes I was planning to make to his trust fund. But more importantly, they confirmed that this wasn't a phase or a temporary reaction to some external stress. This was a pattern of entitled, disrespectful behavior that was becoming more entrenched with each passing week. The most troubling aspect of what I was observing was how little awareness Marcus seemed to have of the impact his behavior had on other people. He wasn't deliberately trying to hurt anyone, he simply didn't consider other people's feelings important enough to factor into his decision-making process. And that lack of empathy, if left unchecked, could lead to much more serious problems as he grew older and gained more independence and authority over others. My meeting with Gerald was scheduled for the following Monday, and I spent the weekend preparing for what I knew would be a difficult but necessary conversation about restructuring Marcus's inheritance in ways that might actually help him develop the character traits he would need to become a responsible, caring adult. Gerald's office occupied the corner suite of a restored Victorian building downtown, its tall windows offering views of the courthouse square where autumn leaves drifted across well-maintained sidewalks. As I settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, I felt the weight of the decision I was about to formalize, but also a sense of clarity that had been building over the past 2 weeks of careful observation and documentation. "I've reviewed all the trust documents over the weekend," Gerald said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he spread several manila folders across his desk. "Based on our previous conversation, I've drafted some modifications that would give you the flexibility you're looking for while protecting everyone's interests legally." The papers he handed me were dense with legal terminology, but the essence was clear. Marcus's trust fund would be restructured to include specific performance criteria that would need to be met before he could access the funds. The criteria included maintaining a grade point average of at least 3.5, completing 50 hours of community service annually, demonstrating financial responsibility through budgeting and savings exercises, and most importantly, receiving positive character references from at least 3 adults who interacted with him regularly outside the family. "The character reference requirement is particularly important," Gerald explained. "It prevents the situation from becoming purely about academic performance or going through the motions with volunteer work. If Marcus can't convince his teachers, coaches, employers, or mentors that he's developed into a respectful, responsible young person, then the financial resources won't be available to him." What struck me most about the revised trust structure was how reasonable and achievable the requirements were for any young person who was genuinely committed to developing good character. These weren't impossible standards designed to punish Marcus, they were basic expectations that any parent or grandparent might have for a child they were investing in financially. "What happens if he fails to meet these criteria?" I asked. "The funds would be redistributed according to your wishes. You could direct them to your other grandchildren, to charitable organizations, or you could establish new trusts for future family members. The key is that Marcus would have multiple opportunities to qualify for the inheritance, but those opportunities wouldn't extend indefinitely." Gerald handed me another document that outlined the timeline for implementation. Marcus would be informed of the new requirements on his 13th birthday, giving him 3 years to demonstrate consistent character growth before the first substantial distribution would be available at age 16. If he met the criteria consistently, he would have access to funds for a car and college expenses. If he didn't, those resources would be redirected to other beneficiaries. The plan was both generous and firm, offering Marcus genuine opportunities to earn his inheritance while ensuring that my resources wouldn't support entitled or disrespectful behavior. But I knew that implementing these changes would require careful communication with Oliver and Vanessa, and that conversation would be far more challenging than the legal documentation.
There's one more thing, Gerald said, as I prepared to leave his office. You might want to consider how you're going to explain these changes to Marcus and his parents. The way you frame this conversation could determine whether it becomes a catalyst for positive change or a source of ongoing family conflict. This was the aspect of the plan that I had been dreading most. Oliver deserved to understand what was happening and why, but I also knew that Vanessa would likely view any changes to Marcus's inheritance as a personal attack on her family. The challenge would be presenting the modifications as an opportunity for Marcus to grow rather than as punishment for his current behavior. That evening, I called Oliver and asked if he could come by my house alone sometime during the week to discuss some family financial matters. I was careful not to mention Marcus or Vanessa specifically, but Oliver's tone suggested that he sensed this conversation would be significant. Is everything okay, Mom? You sound worried about something. Everything's fine from a financial standpoint, I assured him. But I do need to talk with you about some decisions I'm making regarding the grandchildren's inheritance plans. It's nothing urgent, but it is important. We agreed to meet Thursday evening after he finished work. That gave me 3 days to prepare for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had with my son. Wednesday brought an unexpected complication when Vanessa called me directly, something that happened perhaps twice a year, and usually involved requests for me to babysit Marcus during school breaks or help with transportation when their schedules were complicated. Rosalind, I hope you don't mind me calling. Vanessa began, her voice carrying the artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted something. I wanted to talk to you about Marcus's behavior at Sunday dinner last week. This was not what I had been expecting. In all the years I had known Vanessa, she had never initiated a conversation about Marcus's behavior, particularly not to acknowledge that his behavior had been problematic. I'm listening, I said carefully. I think Oliver and I have been too lenient with him lately. He's going through that difficult preteen phase, but that's no excuse for being disrespectful to you. I wanted you to know that we've had some serious conversations with him about his attitude. There was something in Vanessa's tone that made me suspicious of her motives. This sudden concern about Marcus's respect for me seemed out of character, and the timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. I appreciate that, Vanessa. What kinds of conversations have you had with him? We've talked about how much you do for our family, and how important it is for him to show gratitude and respect. We've also discussed some consequences if his behavior doesn't improve. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Vanessa expressing concern about Marcus's developing character and asking for my suggestions about how to address his attitude problems. But throughout the call, I had the distinct impression that this wasn't a genuine acknowledgement of issues I had been observing. Instead, it felt like a preemptive strike, an attempt to demonstrate that she and Oliver were handling the situation before I could raise concerns myself. When Oliver arrived Thursday evening, he looked tired and stressed in a way that suggested his week had been particularly challenging. He accepted my offer of coffee and settled into the living room chair, where he had sat as a child, when we needed to have serious conversations about school or behavior. Vanessa mentioned that you called about financial matters, he said. She seemed to think it might be related to the college funds you've been setting up for the kids. This confirmed my suspicion that Vanessa had somehow anticipated this conversation. Whether she had noticed changes in my behavior toward Marcus or simply had a general awareness that her son's disrespectful attitude might have consequences, she had clearly been preparing Oliver for the possibility that his inheritance expectations might need adjustment. It is related to the college funds, but it's broader than that, I began. I've been doing some thinking about the trust funds I've established for all the grandchildren, and I've decided to make some modifications to ensure that the money is used in ways that support positive character development. Oliver's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. What kind of modifications? I explained the new structure that Gerald had designed, emphasizing the opportunities it would provide for Marcus to demonstrate growth and responsibility. I was careful to frame the changes as educational tools rather than punitive measures, and I made sure to mention that similar expectations would be applied to all of the grandchildren as they reached appropriate ages. So Marcus would need to maintain good grades, do community service, and get positive references from his teachers and coaches in order to access his trust fund. That's correct.
And if he meets those criteria consistently, he'll have access to substantially more resources than most kids his age could even dream of. But if he doesn't meet them, then those resources will be redirected to family members or organizations that are demonstrating the kinds of values I want to support. Oliver was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I was telling him. I could see him weighing his loyalty to his son against his understanding of the behavioral issues that had prompted these changes. Mom, I know Marcus hasn't been at his best lately.
Vanessa and I have been talking about it, and we're planning to be more strict about his attitude and behavior. Maybe we could give him some time to improve before implementing these changes. This was exactly the response I had been expecting, and I had prepared for it carefully. Oliver, the changes aren't punitive, they're educational. Marcus will have 3 years to demonstrate that he can meet very reasonable expectations for any young person who's going to inherit substantial resources. If anything, having clear criteria will help him understand what's expected of him. But what if he doesn't meet the criteria? What happens to his inheritance then? It gets redistributed to people who are demonstrating the character traits I want to encourage. Emma and James, for example, consistently show respect and gratitude. Sophie is too young to evaluate yet, but Michael is raising her with values that I want to support. There are also several scholarship programs for underprivileged kids who could benefit from educational opportunities. The mention of his nieces and nephew seemed to help Oliver understand that this wasn't about playing favorites or making arbitrary decisions. It was about rewarding character traits that contributed to strong families and healthy communities. Have you told Marcus about these changes yet? Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first, but I do plan to explain the new structure to him on his birthday next month. That will give him time to understand what's expected and start working toward meeting the criteria. Oliver rubbed his forehead in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to work through complex problems. Vanessa is going to be upset about this. She's already worried that Marcus doesn't have the same advantages as some of his classmates, and this is going to feel like another obstacle. This comment revealed something important about the family dynamics that had contributed to Marcus's entitled attitude. If Vanessa was consistently focused on what Marcus lacked compared to his peers rather than on what he had been given, it was no wonder that he had developed an attitude of resentment rather than gratitude. Oliver, Marcus has advantages that most children will never have. A trust fund that could pay for his entire college education and provide a down payment on his first home isn't an obstacle, it's an incredible opportunity. But opportunities come with responsibilities, and I want to make sure he learns that connection while he's still young enough to benefit from the lesson. We talked for another hour, with Oliver asking detailed questions about how the criteria would be evaluated and what would happen in various scenarios. Gradually, I could see him beginning to understand that the changes I was proposing weren't arbitrary or vindictive, but were actually designed to help Marcus develop into the kind of person who would use inherited wealth responsibly. There's something else you should know, Oliver said as he prepared to leave. Vanessa has been talking about moving closer to her family in Connecticut. She thinks it would be good for Marcus to be around her cousins who are more his age and share his interests. This information hit me like a physical blow. If Vanessa succeeded in convincing Oliver to move across the country, it would effectively end my relationship with Marcus and eliminate any influence I might have on his character development. It would also mean that the trust fund modifications I was implementing might become irrelevant, since I wouldn't be able to observe his behavior or maintain relationships with his teachers and coaches. How serious are these discussions? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She's been looking at job opportunities and schools online. She hasn't pushed for an immediate decision, but I can tell she's really excited about the possibility. After Oliver left, I sat in my living room feeling the weight of how complicated this situation had become. What had started as a response to Marcus's disrespectful behavior was now intersecting with larger family dynamics and potential geographic relocations that could change everything. I spent Friday morning on the phone with Catherine, who had always been my most trusted advisor when it came to family relationships. I explained the trust fund modifications I was implementing and the possibility that Oliver's family might move to Connecticut. "Mom, I think you're doing exactly the right thing with the trust fund changes," Catherine said firmly. "Marcus needs to learn that respect and responsibility are connected to privilege and opportunity. And if Vanessa is pushing for a move to Connecticut, it's probably because she realizes that her influence over Marcus is stronger when you're not around to provide alternative perspectives. But what if they do move? What if I lose the opportunity to have any relationship with Marcus at all? Then you'll know that you did everything you could to help him develop good character, and you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that your resources are going to people who appreciate them. Besides, there's no guarantee that removing Marcus from your influence will actually benefit him in the long run. He might discover that the world outside your protection is less forgiving of entitled behavior. Catherine's perspective helped me understand that I couldn't control all the variables in this situation, but I could control my own decisions about how to use the resources I had worked so hard to accumulate. Whether Marcus lived nearby or across the country, whether he met the criteria for his trust fund or lost access to it entirely, I would know that I had tried to use my financial legacy to encourage positive character development rather than simply rewarding accident of birth. Saturday brought the most revealing conversation I had yet had with Marcus himself. He called me in the afternoon, something that happened perhaps once every few months and usually indicated that he wanted something specific. "Grandma Rosalind, can I ask you something?" he began, his tone unusually serious. "Of course, sweetheart, what's on your mind?" "Mom said that you've been thinking about changing some things with the money you're saving for me and my cousins. She said it might affect whether I can get a car when I turn 16. So Vanessa had decided to prepare Marcus for the changes I would be announcing, but she had apparently framed them in terms of potential loss rather than opportunity for growth. This was exactly the kind of manipulation I had been observing, turning my attempts to encourage responsibility into threats that Marcus needed to worry about. "Your mom is right that I've been thinking about how to structure the inheritance plans for all of my grandchildren," I said carefully. "But it's not about taking anything away from you, it's about making sure that the money I've saved gets used in ways that help you become the best person you can be. But what if I don't want to do extra stuff to get the money? What if I just want you to give it to me like you planned?" The question revealed so much about Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of how inheritance and family financial support actually worked. He seemed to believe that my money was somehow already his, that he had a right to it regardless of his behavior or character, and that any expectations I might have were unreasonable impositions on his autonomy. "Marcus, the money I've saved for you represents years of hard work and careful planning. I didn't save it because I owed it to you, but because I wanted to help you have opportunities and security. But those opportunities come with responsibilities just like everything else in life. That's not fair though. Emma and James don't have to do extra stuff to get their money. Actually, they will have similar expectations when they reach your age. And Emma and James have consistently shown the kind of respect and gratitude that makes me confident they'll meet those expectations easily." There was a long pause before Marcus responded, and when he did, his voice carried a petulant tone that reminded me of a much younger child. "I don't understand why I have to prove anything to you. You're supposed to love me no matter what." "I do love you no matter what, Marcus. That's exactly why I want to help you develop into a person you can be proud of. Love doesn't mean giving someone everything they want without any expectations. Sometimes love means setting boundaries and standards that help people grow." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but it became clear that Marcus wasn't interested in understanding my perspective or considering how his behavior might need to change. He was focused entirely on what he perceived as threats to his inheritance, and he seemed genuinely bewildered by the idea that his character and behavior might be relevant to his financial future. After ending the call, I realized that this conversation had provided the final piece of evidence I needed to move forward with confidence. Marcus's response to the news about his trust fund modifications revealed everything I needed to know about his current mindset and priorities. He wasn't concerned about whether he was being respectful or responsible. He was only concerned about whether those qualities might be required for him to access money he already considered his own. That evening, I called Gerald to confirm that I wanted to proceed with all the trust modifications we had discussed. I also asked him to begin preparing the documentation that would be needed to establish scholarship funds for underprivileged students, since I was becoming increasingly confident that some of Marcus's inheritance would eventually be redirected to more deserving recipients.
Sunday's family dinner would be the last one before Marcus's birthday, and I planned to use it as a final opportunity to observe his behavior under the new lens of understanding I had developed. I would be watching not just for disrespect or entitlement but for any signs that he was capable of the kind of growth and self-reflection that would be necessary for him to meet the criteria I was establishing. The kitchen felt different as I prepared that Sunday's meal, charged with the weight of decisions made and changes set in motion. The beef bourguignon simmering on the stove was one of Marcus's former favorites, a dish that required hours of careful preparation and attention to detail. As I stirred the rich sauce and checked the tenderness of the meat, I found myself thinking about the parallel between cooking and character development. Both required patience, consistency, and attention to quality ingredients. Both were processes that couldn't be rushed or faked, and both produced results that reflected the care and intention that went into them. When Oliver's family arrived, I noticed immediately that the dynamics felt different from previous visits. Marcus seemed sullen and resentful, as if he were being forced to participate in something he found distasteful. Vanessa was overly solicitous, asking repeatedly if there was anything she could do to help and complimenting my cooking in ways that felt forced and artificial. Oliver appeared uncomfortable, glancing frequently between his wife and his mother as if he were trying to gauge the temperature of a room that might explode at any moment. "Something smells wonderful," Vanessa announced as she entered the kitchen, her voice pitched with false enthusiasm. "You've really outdone yourself today, Rosalind." Marcus, meanwhile, had already planted himself on the living room couch with his phone, making no effort to acknowledge my greeting or offer to help with any aspect of the meal preparation. When I asked him to wash his hands and help carry dishes to the dining room, he complied with obvious reluctance and frequent sighs of frustration. During dinner, Marcus picked at his food without enthusiasm, made several comments about preferring restaurants to home cooking, and spent most of the meal staring at his phone despite repeated requests from his father to put it away. When I asked him about school or his activities, his responses were minimal and delivered with barely concealed irritation. But the most telling moment came when I mentioned that his birthday was coming up and asked what kind of celebration he might like to have. "I want to have my party at Dave and Buster's," he said without looking up from his phone, "and I want to invite my whole class, not just family." "That sounds like fun," I replied. "Would you like me to help with planning or contribute to the cost?" Marcus finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in his expression chilled me. There was no warmth, no affection, no appreciation for my offer to help. There was only calculation, an assessment of what he might be able to extract from me for his benefit. "Yeah, you can pay for it," he said casually. "It's going to be expensive because I want the premium package and good prizes for everyone." The casual assumption that I would fund his party without question, combined with his complete lack of gratitude or even basic politeness in making the request, confirmed everything I had been observing about his character development. This wasn't a temporary phase or a reaction to preteen hormones. This was a fundamental attitude about his entitlement to other people's resources and his lack of obligation to show appreciation or respect in return. "We'll need to discuss the details," I said carefully. "Birthday parties are special occasions, but they're also opportunities to practice gratitude and consideration for others." Marcus shrugged dismissively. "Whatever, just let me know how much money you're willing to spend." After they left that evening, I sat in my dining room surrounded by the remnants of another family dinner that had been marked more by tension and disappointment than by connection and joy. The china plates that had served 4 generations of my family reflected the light from the chandelier my husband had installed 40 years ago, and I found myself wondering whether Marcus would ever appreciate the history and love that surrounded him, or whether he would always see family gatherings as obligations to be endured rather than privileges to be treasured. The following morning I called the party venue and the catering company I had been considering for Marcus's birthday celebration. Instead of booking the expensive party he had requested, I arranged for a small family gathering at my house with a simple cake and modest gifts. If Marcus wanted to learn about the connection between respect and generosity, his 13th birthday would provide an excellent opportunity for that education to begin. The confrontation I had been anticipating was about to begin in earnest, and I was as ready as I could be for the challenging conversations and difficult decisions that lay ahead. Marcus's 13th birthday fell on a crisp November Saturday that painted the maple trees in my backyard brilliant shades of gold and crimson. I had spent the morning preparing his favorite chocolate cake from scratch, the same recipe my mother had used for my children's birthdays decades ago. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and cocoa, familiar scents that usually filled me with anticipation for celebrating another year of a grandchild's growth and development.
But today felt different. Today would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Marcus's life, one where his inheritance would be directly tied to his character development and his ability to demonstrate the values I had tried to instill in all of my grandchildren. The legal documents sat in a manila envelope on my kitchen counter, ready to be presented after the birthday cake had been served, and the initial excitement of gift opening had subsided. Oliver arrived first, carrying a wrapped bicycle that Marcus had been requesting for months. Vanessa followed with an armload of smaller packages and a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had been unusually quiet during our brief phone conversations over the past week, and I suspected that Oliver had shared some details about our discussion regarding the trust fund modifications. Marcus bounded into the house with the energetic enthusiasm that 13-year-olds brought to their own birthday celebrations, though his greeting to me was perfunctory at best. He headed straight for the pile of gifts on the dining room table, his excitement focused entirely on what he might receive rather than on the people who had gathered to celebrate with him. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, offering him the same warm hug I had given him every year since he was born. His response was brief and distracted, his attention already shifting to the packages waiting to be opened. The gift opening proceeded predictably, with Marcus tearing through wrapping paper with little regard for the care that had been taken in selecting and wrapping each present. He was pleased with the bicycle, moderately interested in the video games Oliver and Vanessa had chosen, and dismissive of the leather-bound journal I had selected for him, complete with his initials embossed in gold. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, holding the journal as if it were something distasteful. "It's for writing down your thoughts, your goals, your experiences as you become a teenager," I explained. "I thought you might enjoy documenting this important time in your life." Marcus set the journal aside without further comment, and moved on to the next gift, clearly uninterested in anything that didn't provide immediate entertainment value. His lack of appreciation for the thoughtfulness behind the gift wasn't surprising, but it still stung to see something I had chosen with such care dismissed so casually. After the gifts had been opened and the cake served, I asked everyone to remain at the dining room table for a few more minutes. "Marcus, now that you're 13, there are some important things we need to discuss about your future and the plans I've been making to help support your education and other opportunities." Vanessa's posture immediately tensed, and I could see Oliver shooting her a warning glance that suggested they had already discussed this moment extensively. Marcus, however, looked genuinely curious for the first time all afternoon. "Are you talking about my college fund?" he asked. "I'm talking about something much more comprehensive than that," I replied, opening the manila envelope and removing the trust fund documents that Gerald had prepared. "Over the years, I've been building a substantial trust fund for you that would provide money for college, a car when you turn 16, and eventually help with things like a down payment on your first home." Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement, exactly the reaction I had been expecting. Money represented freedom and opportunities to him, but he had never connected those opportunities to the responsibilities that should accompany them. "However," I continued, "I've decided that access to these funds should be contingent on your demonstrating the kind of character and responsibility that will help you use them wisely." The excitement in Marcus's expression began to fade as he sensed that conditions were about to be attached to what he had apparently considered his guaranteed inheritance. Vanessa asked sharply, her protective instincts clearly activated by any perceived threat to her son's financial future. I explained the criteria that Gerald and I had developed, emphasizing the opportunities they represented for Marcus to grow and develop rather than the obstacles they might present. The grade point average requirement was modest and achievable for any student who was genuinely committed to learning. The community service requirement would expose him to different perspectives and help him develop empathy for people facing challenges he had never experienced. The character references would encourage him to build positive relationships with adults who could serve as mentors and guides during his teenage years. "So basically you're bribing me to be good?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying a mixture of resentment and confusion. I'm creating a structure that rewards the kind of person I hope you'll choose to become, I replied. The money has always been intended to help you build a successful, meaningful life. These criteria are designed to ensure that you develop the skills and character traits that will make success possible. Oliver had remained quiet during my explanation, but I could see him processing the implications of what I was proposing. He understood better than Vanessa did that the requirements I was establishing were not only reasonable but probably beneficial for Marcus's development. What happens if I don't want to do all that stuff? Marcus asked, what if I just want you to give me the money like you promised? This question revealed everything I needed to know about Marcus's fundamental understanding of how inheritance and family financial support actually worked. He believed that my money was somehow already his by right, that he was entitled to it regardless of his behavior or character, and that my attempts to encourage positive development were unfair impositions on his autonomy. I never promised to give you money unconditionally, Marcus. I promised to help support your future if you demonstrated that you were ready for that kind of responsibility. These criteria are how we'll determine whether you're ready. Vanessa could no longer contain her anger. This is emotional manipulation, Rosalind. You're using money to control Marcus's behavior, and that's not healthy for anyone. I'm using money to encourage positive character development, I replied firmly. Every parent and grandparent makes decisions about how to allocate their resources based on their children's needs and behaviors. This is no different, but you're threatening to take away his inheritance if he doesn't jump through arbitrary hoops that you've created. The hoops aren't arbitrary, Vanessa. They're based on character traits that will serve Marcus well throughout his life regardless of whether he ever receives a penny of inheritance from me. And I'm not taking away anything that was ever guaranteed to him in the first place. Oliver finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority that came from being Marcus's father and the person ultimately responsible for his character development. These are the kinds of expectations any parent might have for a teenager. But it's not fair, Marcus protested, his voice rising with adolescent indignation. Emma and James don't have to do extra stuff to get their money. Emma and James already demonstrate the character traits that these criteria are designed to encourage, I explained. They're respectful, grateful, hardworking, and considerate of others. You have the same opportunities to develop those traits. I don't want to have to prove myself to you, Marcus said, his tone becoming increasingly petulant. You're supposed to love me no matter what. I do love you no matter what, which is exactly why I want to help you become the best person you can be. Love doesn't mean giving someone everything they want without any expectations. Sometimes love means setting boundaries that encourage growth. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus alternating between anger and attempts at negotiation. He wanted to know if he could meet some of the criteria but not others, whether the grade point average requirement could be lowered, whether community service could be replaced with other activities he found more appealing. Each question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose behind the requirements. Vanessa remained hostile throughout the discussion, framing every criterion as unreasonable and every expectation as manipulative. But I could see that Oliver was beginning to understand the educational value of what I was proposing, and that gave me hope that Marcus might eventually receive the parental support he would need to meet the standards I was establishing. There's one more thing you need to understand, Marcus, I said, as the conversation began to wind down. These criteria aren't punishments, they're opportunities. If you meet them consistently, you'll have access to resources that most young people can only dream of. But if you choose not to meet them, then those resources will be redirected to people who are demonstrating the character traits I want to encourage. Like who? Marcus asked. Like Emma and James, who consistently show respect and appreciation. Like scholarship programs for students who don't have the advantages you've been given but who are working hard to create better futures for themselves. This seemed to hit Marcus differently than anything else I had said. The possibility that his inheritance might go to other family members or to strangers who were more deserving than he was appeared to genuinely surprise him. That evening, after Oliver's family had gone home, I called Catherine to update her on how the conversation had gone. She listened without interruption as I described Marcus's reactions and Vanessa's hostility. How do you think Oliver is handling all of this? Catherine asked. Better than I expected, actually.
I think he's starting to see that these expectations might actually benefit Marcus in the long run. But he's also trying to keep peace in his marriage, which complicates things. And Marcus is angry and confused, but I think that's normal. He's never had to consider the connection between his behavior and the opportunities available to him. It's going to take time for him to adjust to the idea that respect and responsibility are linked to privilege. Over the following weeks, I began to see subtle changes in the family dynamics during our Sunday dinners. Marcus was still sullen and resentful, but he was also more observant, as if he were trying to figure out exactly what behaviors would be required to maintain access to his trust fund. Vanessa remained cold and distant, but she was no longer openly hostile. Oliver seemed more engaged in Marcus's behavior, offering gentle corrections when his son was disrespectful and praise when he made efforts to be helpful. The most significant change came 6 weeks after Marcus's birthday, when he called me on a Tuesday evening with what appeared to be a genuine apology. "Grandma Rosalind, I've been thinking about what you said on my birthday, and I think maybe I haven't been very nice to you lately." This was more self-awareness than Marcus had demonstrated in years, and I felt a spark of hope that the trust fund modifications might actually be working as intended. "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. What made you think about it?" "My teacher, Mrs. Williams, asked us to write essays about people who have influenced our lives, and I was trying to think of what to write about you. But when I thought about how I've been acting, I realized that if someone treated me the way I've been treating you, I would be really hurt." This was exactly the kind of empathy and self-reflection that I had been hoping to encourage. "That shows a lot of maturity, sweetheart. I'm proud of you for recognizing that. Would it be okay if I came over this weekend and helped you bake something, like we used to do when I was little?" The request caught me completely off guard. Marcus hadn't shown interest in our baking traditions for over 2 years, and I had assumed that phase of our relationship was permanently over. "I would love that," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "What would you like to make? Could we make those sugar cookies with the icing? The ones shaped like leaves and pumpkins?" Saturday afternoon found Marcus standing beside me in my kitchen, carefully rolling out cookie dough with the same concentration he had shown as a much younger child. His phone remained in his backpack, untouched, while we worked together to create the autumn-themed cookies that had been one of our favorite shared activities. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" Marcus said as we waited for the first batch of cookies to finish baking. "Of course, the things you want me to do to keep my trust fund, are they really that hard?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "They're not hard, Marcus, but they do require consistent effort and genuine commitment to becoming a better person. The question isn't whether you're capable of meeting those standards, because I know you are. The question is whether you're willing to make the choices necessary to meet them. What if I try really hard but I still mess up sometimes? Everyone makes mistakes, sweetheart." The criteria aren't about being perfect. They're about demonstrating consistent effort to grow and improve. If you're genuinely trying to be respectful and responsible, occasional mistakes won't disqualify you from your inheritance. Over the following months, I watched Marcus's behavior evolve gradually but consistently. He began volunteering at a local food bank, initially because he needed community service hours, but eventually because he seemed to genuinely enjoy the work. His grades improved as he started taking his academic responsibilities more seriously. Most importantly, his interactions with me became warmer and more respectful, as if he were rediscovering the loving relationship we had shared when he was younger. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. There were still moments when Marcus's entitled attitude surfaced, still times when he seemed more focused on meeting the minimum requirements than on genuine character development. But there were also moments of authentic growth and connection that reminded me of the sweet, loving child he had been and could be again. Vanessa's attitude toward me remained cool, but she stopped actively undermining my relationship with Marcus. I suspected that she had realized the trust fund modifications weren't going to be reversed, and that her best strategy was to help Marcus meet the criteria rather than fighting against them. Oliver seemed relieved to have clear expectations for Marcus's behavior and concrete goals to work toward as a family. The structure that the trust fund modifications provided had actually made his parenting job easier, giving him objective standards to reference when Marcus complained about expectations or consequences.
On Marcus's 14th birthday, I presented him with a progress report that documented his improvements over the past year. His grades had increased from a 3.2 to a 3.6 grade point average. He had completed 60 hours of community service at the food bank and had received glowing reviews from the volunteer coordinator. His teachers consistently reported that he was more respectful and engaged in class, and his soccer coach had praised his leadership with younger players. "This is really good progress, Marcus," I told him as we reviewed the report together. "You should be proud of how much you've grown over the past year." "Does this mean I get to keep my trust fund?" he asked, though his tone suggested that he already knew the answer. "It means you're demonstrating exactly the kind of character development that the trust fund was designed to encourage. If you keep making this kind of progress, you'll have access to resources that will help you build whatever kind of future you choose." Marcus smiled, and for the first time in years it was a smile that reached his eyes and reminded me of the joyful child who had once spent every Sunday afternoon in my kitchen, eager to learn and happy to help. 6 months later, when Marcus turned 15, I made the first substantial distribution from his trust fund, providing money for a used car that he had earned through his consistent demonstration of responsibility and maturity. Watching him drive away from my house that day, careful and proud behind the wheel of his first vehicle, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. The trust fund had served its intended purpose, not just as a financial resource but as an educational tool that helped Marcus understand the connection between choices and consequences, between respect and reward, between character and opportunity. He had learned that inheritance wasn't an entitlement but a privilege that needed to be earned through consistent demonstration of the values that make communities and families strong. As I stood in my driveway watching Marcus's taillights disappear around the corner, I thought about the lesson this experience had taught me as well. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to set boundaries and expectations that encourage them to become their best selves. Sometimes generosity requires the wisdom to know when to give and when to withhold, when to comfort and when to challenge. The trust fund that had started as a simple expression of love for a grandchild had evolved into something much more meaningful, a tool for character development, a bridge between generations, and a testament to the idea that true wealth isn't just about money, but about the values and relationships that give life meaning and purpose. Marcus still had years of growth ahead of him, still had opportunities to succeed or stumble as he navigated the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood. But he now had a framework for understanding that his choices mattered, that his character had consequences, and that the people who loved him had expectations as well as gifts to offer. The years that followed Marcus's 15th birthday brought a depth to our relationship that I hadn't experienced since he was a small child. The trust fund modifications had created a framework for accountability, but more importantly, they had opened pathways for genuine connection and mutual respect that transcended financial considerations. Marcus's junior year of high school marked a particularly significant turning point. He had maintained his improved grade point average, now consistently earning a 3.8 while taking several advanced placement courses. His commitment to community service had evolved beyond the minimum requirements, and he had become a team leader at the food bank where he spent Saturday mornings helping coordinate volunteer efforts and training new participants. But it was his growing awareness of economic inequality that impressed me most. During one of our Sunday dinners, he began asking thoughtful questions about why some families struggled to afford basic necessities, while others had resources they took for granted. "Grandma Rosalind, I've been working with this family at the food bank," Marcus said as he helped me clear the dinner dishes. "The mom works 2 jobs but still can't always pay rent and buy groceries. Their daughter is my age and she's really smart, but she doesn't think she can afford college. It doesn't seem fair." These were the kinds of observations I had hoped Marcus would develop through his volunteer work. The boy who had once complained about my old people food was now recognizing his own privilege and developing empathy for people facing genuine hardships. "What do you think could be done to help families like that?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "I was thinking maybe I could use some of my trust fund money to create a scholarship for kids at the food bank. Not all of it, but maybe enough to help a few students get started with college." The suggestion took my breath away.
Marcus was proposing to use his inheritance not just for his own benefit, but to create opportunities for others who lacked his advantages. This represented exactly the kind of character development I had hoped the trust fund structure would encourage. That's a thoughtful idea, Marcus. Tell me more about how you envision something like that working. Over the following weeks, Marcus researched scholarship programs and developed a detailed proposal for what he called the Second Chances Education Fund. His plan was sophisticated and well-reasoned, demonstrating not just good intentions but genuine understanding of the practical challenges faced by students from low-income families. The scholarship would provide not just tuition assistance but also support for books, transportation, and other expenses that often prevented capable students from completing their education. Marcus had even identified potential mentorship components, connecting scholarship recipients with successful professionals who could provide guidance and networking opportunities. When he presented his formal proposal to me 3 months later, I realized that the entitled, disrespectful child who had dismissed my cooking as gross old people food had evolved into a thoughtful young man with genuine concern for others and sophisticated understanding of how resources could be used to create positive change. I've calculated that I could fund scholarships for 12 students over 4 years using about 30% of my current trust fund balance. Marcus explained, showing me spreadsheets he had created to track projected costs and impact. The remaining money would still be more than enough for my car, college expenses, and a down payment on a house eventually. The mathematical precision of his planning impressed me, but it was his willingness to sacrifice personal financial gain for the benefit of others that truly demonstrated how far he had come in his character development. Have you discussed this with your parents? I asked. Dad thinks it's a great idea. Mom was worried at first that I was giving away too much of my inheritance, but when I showed her the numbers, she agreed that it made sense. Vanessa's evolution throughout this process had been almost as remarkable as Marcus's. The woman who had once viewed my trust fund modifications as emotional manipulation had gradually come to understand that the structure had actually benefited her son in ways that went far beyond financial security. She had begun attending Marcus's volunteer shifts at the food bank, initially to supervise but eventually because she found the work meaningful. Her perspective on wealth and privilege had shifted as she witnessed firsthand the struggles of families who lacked the advantages she had always taken for granted. Rosalind, I owe you an apology, Vanessa had said to me during a quiet moment at Marcus's 16th birthday celebration. I thought you were trying to control Marcus through money, but I can see now that you were trying to teach him values that money can't buy. The acknowledgement meant more to me than she probably realized. Our relationship would never be as close as I might have wished, but we had reached a place of mutual respect and shared commitment to Marcus's continued growth and development. Marcus's senior year brought new challenges and opportunities that tested his character in different ways. He was accepted to several prestigious universities, each offering different advantages and requiring different financial commitments. The decision-making process revealed how thoroughly he had internalized the lessons about responsibility and long-term thinking that the trust fund structure had been designed to teach. Rather than choosing the most expensive or prestigious option, Marcus selected a state university with an excellent business program and strong community service initiatives. His reasoning was both practical and values-driven. The lower tuition costs would preserve more of his trust fund for the scholarship program he wanted to establish. And the university's emphasis on social responsibility aligned with his developing interests in using business skills to address social problems. I want to study business so I can learn how to make the scholarship program more effective, he explained, when announcing his college choice. But I also want to understand how successful companies can contribute to solving problems like poverty and inequality. The integration of personal goals with social responsibility demonstrated a level of maturity that extended far beyond his 18 years. Marcus had learned not just to meet the criteria I had established for his trust fund, but to exceed them in ways that reflected genuine character growth and authentic commitment to making positive contributions to the world. His graduation day was one of the proudest moments of my life, not because of his academic achievements, though those were impressive, but because of the young man he had become. When he gave the valedictorian speech to his graduating class, he spoke about the importance of using privilege responsibly and creating opportunities for others who hadn't been as fortunate. "We've all been given advantages that we didn't earn," Marcus told his classmates. "The question isn't whether we deserve what we've been given, but whether we'll use what we've been given to help others and make our communities stronger." The speech received a standing ovation, but what moved me most was seeing other parents approach Marcus afterward to thank him for inspiring their own children to think more seriously about service and responsibility. That summer, before Marcus left for college, we established the Second Chances Education Fund as a formal nonprofit organization. Marcus served as the founding president, with guidance from a board of directors that included Gerald, Margaret, and several other professionals who had expertise in education and nonprofit management. The first scholarship recipients were selected through a rigorous process that Marcus had designed to identify not just students with financial need, but young people who demonstrated the same kinds of character traits that had become so important in his own development. Academic achievement was considered, but so were community service, leadership potential, and evidence of resilience in overcoming challenges. "I want to fund students who remind me of who I used to be," Marcus explained as we reviewed applications. "Kids who have potential but maybe haven't learned yet how to use their advantages responsibly. The scholarship can be part of helping them grow the same way the trust fund structure helped me grow." The wisdom in this approach impressed me deeply. Marcus wasn't just creating financial assistance for deserving students, he was replicating the educational model that had been so effective in his own character development. As Marcus prepared to leave for college, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had traveled together over the past 5 years. What had begun as a response to his disrespectful behavior had evolved into a comprehensive education in character, responsibility, and social awareness. The trust fund had served its intended purpose perfectly, not just as a financial resource but as a tool for teaching essential life lessons. Marcus had learned that privilege comes with responsibility, that respect must be earned through consistent behavior, and that true wealth lies not in accumulating resources but in using them to create positive impact. But perhaps most importantly, he had learned that character development is an ongoing process, not a destination. The criteria I had established for his trust fund weren't requirements he had met and could now forget, they were standards he had internalized and would carry with him throughout his life. On the day Marcus left for college, he hugged me with the same warmth and affection he had shown as a small child, before entitlement and disrespect had created distance between us. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Grandma Rosalind," he said. "I know I was pretty awful for a while there." "You were never awful, sweetheart, you were just learning. We all were. The trust fund thing was really smart, even though I hated it at first. It made me think about things I never would have considered otherwise. The money was never the point, Marcus. The point was helping you become the kind of person who would use opportunities wisely and treat others with respect and kindness." "I think I'm getting there," he said, with a smile that reminded me of the sweet child he had been and the remarkable adult he was becoming. As I watched his car disappear down my street, loaded with everything he would need for his freshman year, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial planning and everything to do with family legacy. The trust fund would continue to support Marcus's education and eventually help him establish his adult life, but the real inheritance I had given him was the understanding that wealth without character is meaningless, and that true success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. The Second Chances Education Fund would continue operating long after Marcus graduated from college, providing opportunities for students who needed both financial assistance and the kind of character development that comes from understanding the connection between privilege and responsibility. Each scholarship recipient would learn the same lessons Marcus had learned: that opportunities must be earned, that respect must be demonstrated, and that the greatest satisfaction in life comes from using your advantages to help others achieve their potential. Years later, when Marcus established his own successful consulting firm specializing in helping companies develop socially responsible business practices, he would continue to fund the scholarship program and expand its reach to help even more students. The entitled child who had once dismissed my cooking and my values had grown into a leader who understood that true wealth lies in creating opportunities for others and building stronger, more equitable communities. The trust fund had worked exactly as intended, not just as a financial instrument, but as a tool for character education and family legacy building. And every time I saw Marcus's name in the newspaper recognizing his business success or his charitable contributions, I was reminded that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to set high standards and help them rise to meet those standards. The cooking that he had once called gross old people food had become a symbol of tradition, family connection, and the kind of values that money couldn't buy, but that money could be used to support and spread to others who needed the same opportunities for growth and development. In the end, the trust fund had taught all of us that inheritance isn't just about transferring wealth from one generation to the next. It's about transferring values, character, and the understanding that with great privilege comes great responsibility to use that privilege in ways that honor the sacrifices of previous generations and create opportunities for future ones. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.